Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I've got a collection of unsettling, creeping horror stories sourced straight from the darkest corners of the internet. Before we jump in, make sure to drop a like, hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments which story sent a chill down your spine today. Grab your headset, get comfortable, and let's dive in. Story 1. The house at the end of the ridge has an extra floor. My wife Sarah and I spent 6 months looking for a house that was completely detached from society. We were both burned out from working remote tech jobs in a crowded city apartment where we could hear our neighbors flush their toilets through the drywalls. We wanted privacy, quiet, and room to breathe. When we found the property on Blackwood Ridge, it seemed almost absurdly cheap. It was a sprawling 3-story Victorian style farmhouse sitting on 4 acres of overgrown land at the dead end of an unpaved mountain road. The nearest town was a 15-minute drive down the winding ridge, and the closest neighbor was nearly a mile back down the mountain. The real estate listing had minimal photos, and the seller was an estate liquidator who clearly just wanted to clear the deed after the previous owner, an elderly recluse named Arthur Vance, passed away. We closed on the house in late September. The first week was pure bliss. The air smelled like pine and damp soil. The silence at night was thick and peaceful, and the house itself had an incredible vintage charm. Sure, the floorboards creaked like old ships, and the wiring was a bit outdated, but it felt like ours. The house had 3 main levels: a ground floor with a kitchen, living room, and study, a second floor with 3 bedrooms, and a third floor, which was a finished attic space with exposed wooden beams and angled ceilings that we decided to use for general storage. On our 9th night in the house, I was sitting in the kitchen around 1 a.m., working through a backlog of emails. Sarah had gone up to bed hours earlier. The house was dead quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the gentle rustle of wind against the heavy glass windows. Then I heard the footsteps. They weren't on the second floor, they were above it. Heavy, deliberate, bare feet pacing slowly across a hard surface. Thump, thump, thump. I froze, my fingers hovering over my laptop keyboard. My initial thought was that a raccoon or a stray animal had gotten into the attic through a gap in the roof. But the rhythm was wrong. It wasn't the rapid, erratic scurrying of a quadruped. It was the distinct 2-beat cadence of a heavy adult human walking back and forth. I stood up, grabbing a heavy brass flashlight from the kitchen counter. I crept up the main staircase to the second floor. The door to our bedroom was cracked open, and I could hear Sarah's steady, soft breathing. She was fast asleep. I continued up the narrow, carpeted stairs leading to the third floor attic. The air grew noticeably colder with every step I took. When I reached the top landing, I pushed open the heavy oak door. I shined the flashlight beam across the room. Boxes of winter clothes, old furniture, and rolled up rugs sat undisturbed. The dust on the floor was thick and unbroken. There was no one there. The pacing had stopped the moment my foot hit the attic threshold. I checked the small rectangular window at the gable end. It was latched tight from the inside. I shook my head, writing it off to the house settling under the dropping mountain temperatures, and went back down to sleep. The next afternoon, a local contractor named Dan came by to inspect the roof and gutters before the winter weather set in. Dan was a broad-shouldered guy in his late 50s with weathered skin and a slow, cautious way of speaking. He had lived in the Ridge Valley his entire life. As he set up his tall extension ladder against the side of the house, he looked up at the structure, squinting against the bright autumn sun. "You two living here alone?" Dan asked, wiping his brow with a greasy rag. Just Sarah and me, I said, handing him a bottle of water. And our cat, if you count him. Dan took a long sip, his eyes still tracing the exterior walls of the house. You ever talk to old Arthur before he passed? No, I replied. We bought it through the estate. Dan nodded slowly. Arthur was a weird duck, lived up here 40 years. People down in town used to say he was building something up here, but no one ever came up to check. Towards the end, he stopped coming into town altogether. Mail carrier said he used to see Arthur sitting out on the porch, staring up at his own roof for hours at a time. Building what? I asked. Dan shrugged. Who knows? Old minds play tricks on people when they live alone in the woods too long. Dan climbed up the ladder to inspect the upper roof line. I went inside to make lunch. 10 minutes later, I heard Dan coming back down the ladder briskly. He knocked hard on the kitchen door. When I opened it, Dan looked pale. His knuckles were white where he gripped his tool belt. Hey, pal, Dan said, his voice dropping an octave. Where does the staircase to the top floor lead? The attic, I said, pointing up. 3rd floor. Dan pulled out a yellow tape measure from his belt and held it out. I just measured your exterior vertical drop from the roof soffit down to the foundation. From the outside, this house has 4 distinct rows of window frames and 4 structural floor levels. But when I was inside helping you carry that sofa yesterday, there are only 3 flights of stairs. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. What do you mean? It's a 3-story house. Look up, Dan said, stepping back into the yard and pointing up at the side facade. I stepped out onto the grass and looked up. Ground floor windows, 2nd floor bedroom windows, 3rd floor attic windows. And then, nestled directly between the 2nd floor and the attic level, was a narrow, horizontal strip of 3 dark, grime-covered windows. They were tucked under the overhang of the decorative trim, almost completely obscured by old ivy and dark paint. I had lived here for nearly 2 weeks and had never noticed them. From the inside of the house, there was no hallway, no door, and no staircase that corresponded to that level. There's a gap, Dan whispered, about 6 or 7 feet of vertical space between your bedroom ceiling and the attic floorboards. It's built into the center frame of the house. My stomach did a slow, sickening flip. A dead space? Architects do it sometimes in old Victorian mansions for ventilation or secret storage, Dan said, packing his tools into his truck with sudden haste. But that space out there? Those windows are clean on the inside. Somebody's been wiping the glass from the interior. Dan left 20 minutes later, refusing to take payment for the roof inspection. He told me to call the county surveyor if I wanted answers, but advised me to just leave it alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Sarah went to bed around 10 p.m., completely unaware of what Dan and I had discussed. I sat in the living room with a tape measure, a notebook, and a hammer. Around 1:30 a.m., the temperature in the living room plummeted. My breath began to bloom in faint white clouds. And then, the footsteps returned. This time, they weren't above the attic. They were directly above the hallway ceiling on the 2nd floor. Thump, drag. Thump, drag. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across raw, unpolished wood. I crept up to the 2nd floor hallway. The sound was coming from directly above my head, in the void between the 2nd floor ceiling and the 3rd floor carpet. I raised my hand and pushed my knuckles against the hallway plaster ceiling. It was ice cold to the touch. As soon as my skin made contact with the ceiling, the dragging sound stopped right above me. A second later, 3 sharp, rhythmic knocks sounded from inside the ceiling plaster, right where my hand was resting. Knock, knock, knock. I scrambled back, dropping my flashlight. It rolled down the carpeted stairs, its beam bouncing erratically off the walls. I grabbed it, my heart hammering against my ribs, and ran into our bedroom. I locked the door, woke Sarah up, and told her we were staying in a hotel down in town for the night. She thought I was having a panic attack, but when she saw the look on my face, she didn't argue. We threw some clothes into a bag and left at 2:15 a.m. The next morning, I drove back up to the house alone. I had bought a heavy crowbar, a headlamp, and a sledgehammer from a hardware store in town. I couldn't live with the dread of the unknown. If there was a physical space inside that house, I was going to find the entrance. I searched every inch of the second floor. I pulled out closets, tapped along the wood paneling, and measured the wall depths. In the back of the master bedroom closet, behind a hanging rack of heavy coats, I noticed something strange. The baseboard didn't match the rest of the room. It was held in place by small, modern brass screws instead of old iron nails. I grabbed a screwdriver and backed the screws out. The paneling slid away effortlessly. Behind it was a narrow, square hatch cut directly into the lath and plaster, no larger than 2 feet wide. The air spilling out of the opening smelled overpoweringly of ancient dust, copper, and something sickeningly sweet, like decaying apples. I strapped on my headlamp, gripped the crowbar tightly in my right hand, and crawled through the hatch. The space inside was cramped, only about 5.5 feet high. The floor was made of rough, unfinished pine planks, and the walls were exposed wooden studs lined with yellowing newspaper pages dating back to the late 1980s. It was a hidden corridor running through the entire structural core of the house. As I ducked my head and crept forward, the beam of my headlamp cut through the thick, hanging dust. The corridor opened up into a small, windowless central room built directly behind the chimney stack. In the center of the room sat a single, rusted folding chair. In front of the chair was a small wooden table. On the table lay an old cassette tape recorder, several notebooks bound in black leather, and 3 small, clear glass jars. I stepped closer, my boots creaking softly on the floorboards. I picked up one of the jars. Inside was a collection of human teeth, clean and organized by size. My hands began to shake violently. I put the jar down and opened the top leather notebook. The handwriting inside was frantic, jagged, and dense. It belonged to Arthur Vance. I flipped to the final entries, dated just weeks before Arthur's death. September 4th. It doesn't like the light from the attic anymore. It moved down into the core weeks ago. It sits behind the chimney while I sleep. I can hear it mimicking my voice when I talk to myself in the kitchen. September 12th. I tried to nail the closet hatch shut today, but the nails pulled themselves out of the plaster by evening. It wants the door left unlatched. It told me it likes the new smells coming from down the ridge. September 18th. I am so tired. It promised me that if I stay in the chair long enough, it will let me sleep. But every time I close my eyes, I hear it standing right behind the wallpaper. I dropped the notebook onto the table. My breath hit my throat like ice. From the far end of the narrow corridor, the section leading deeper toward the space directly above our bedroom, I heard a sound. It was a low, wet, rattling exhale. I spun my headlamp toward the dark tunnel. Standing at the far edge of the light beam, bent at an impossible, sickening angle to fit under the low 5-foot ceiling, was a figure. It was unnaturally tall and painfully thin. Its gray skin stretched so tightly over its visible ribs that the bones looked like they were about to burst through the flesh. It wore the faded, threadbare remnants of old work clothes. Its arms were far too long for its torso, its elongated fingers brushing against the floor planks. but it was the face that paralyzed me. It had no nose, no hair, and empty, dark sockets where eyes should have been. Its jaw was unhinged, hanging open in a slack, hollow O. As the beam of my headlamp hit its face, its pale throat convulsed. Then it spoke. It didn't use its own voice. It used my voice. Sarah, the thing rasped in my exact tone, pitch, and inflection, echoing through the narrow wooden tunnel. Sarah, can you come up here for a second? A wave of pure primal terror surged through my body. I didn't think. I didn't breathe. I just turned and scrambled backward down the corridor on my hands and knees. Behind me, I heard the rapid, heavy thump, thump, thump of its long limbs slapping against the wooden planks as it pursued me through the crawl space. I reached the hatch in the closet wall, threw myself through the opening, and crashed onto the floor of the master bedroom. I grabbed the heavy wooden dresser nearby and shoved it with all the strength I had left, slamming it against the closet door. From inside the closet wall, something slammed heavily against the wood with enough force to crack the plaster surrounding the frame. I didn't stop. I ran down the stairs, threw open the front door, got into my truck, and floored the accelerator down the mountain road, never looking back in the rearview mirror. We called the police from town. 2 deputies went up to search the property. They found the open hatch, the room behind the chimney, the notebooks, and the jars of teeth. But they found no sign of anyone living inside the space. They claimed it was likely a squatter who had fled into the woods when I entered. We put the house back on the market 3 days later at a massive loss. We never spent another night on Blackwood Ridge. We live in a modern, single-story suburban home now. No attics, no basements, no crawl spaces. Everything was returning to normal until last night. I was sitting in our living room around 2 a.m., working on my laptop. Sarah was asleep in the bedroom down the hall. The house was completely quiet. Then I heard a faint, wet, rattling sound coming from the air conditioning vent in the floor right beneath my chair. And a second later, my own voice whispered up through the metal grate. Sarah, I found where we live now. Story 2. The night shift at Lakeview Storage has one unwritten rule. When I took the overnight security position at Lakeview Self Storage, I thought I had scored the easiest paycheck of my life. The facility sat on 12 acres of cleared land 3 miles outside of town, bordered on 3 sides by dense, unmanaged pine forest. It consisted of 16 long, parallel metal buildings painted a dull tan, housing over 800 individual storage units behind a heavy, automated chain link gate. My job was straightforward. Sit in the air-conditioned front office from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., monitor the closed-circuit camera feed, and conduct 3 manual foot patrols across the property every night. On my first night, the outgoing manager, a weary guy named Marcus who was quitting to move out of state, handed me a key ring, a heavy aluminum flashlight, and a worn, leather-bound binder labeled Night Shift Standard Operating Procedures. Everything's automated, Marcus said, slinging his jacket over his shoulder. Tenants can only access their units until 9 p.m. After that, the gate locks out all keypads automatically. If someone's inside after 9 o'clock, they're trespassing. He paused at the door, his eyes lingering on the monitor bank, displaying the 16 long rows of darkened steel doors. Read the binder, Marcus added, his voice dropping slightly. Especially page 4. Don't skip it. After Marcus left, I settled into the squeaky office chair and opened the binder. Pages 1 through 3 were standard corporate boilerplate: fire protocols, incident reporting formats, and maintenance phone numbers. Page 4, however, was written in dark blue ballpoint pen. clearly added by a previous guard. Critical protocols for overnight patrol. During your 2 a.m. walk, check Unit 412 in Building D. Ensure the double padlock is secure. If you hear knocking from inside any unit, do not check the lock. Do not speak. Continue walking. If you see a tenant walking down the lanes after midnight, do not approach them. Walk directly back to the front office, lock the door, and monitor them on camera 8. If camera 8 goes black, turn off the office lights immediately and do not look out the front window until sunrise. I laughed out loud in the quiet office. In my experience, senior security guards loved messing with the new hires by inventing local urban legends. I tossed the binder onto the desk, turned on my small portable TV, and let the hours roll by. At 1:55 a.m., the alarm on my watch beeped, signaling my second foot patrol. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the office into the cool night air. The property was eerily quiet. The only sounds were the distant hum of the highway and the sharp crunch of my gravel-soled boots against the asphalt. High overhead, a floodlight mounted on Building A cast harsh, long shadows between the rows. I walked down row C, shining my beam at the heavy brass padlocks securing each corrugated metal door. Everything was quiet. I turned the corner into row D, a long, narrow alleyway between buildings D and E. The fluorescent light at the far end was flickering, buzzing like an angry insect. I remembered Protocol 1. Check Unit 412 in Building D. I walked down the row until I reached 412. It looked like every other unit, a 10 by 20 foot roll-up door painted beige. But unlike the other units, which had a single padlock, Unit 412 had two massive, heavy-duty steel disc locks securing the latch to the concrete floor. I stepped closer and shone my flashlight at the frame. The steel door was visibly warped from the inside out, as if something extraordinarily heavy had been repeatedly shoved against the metal panel. I reached down to test the top padlock. The moment my bare fingers touched the cold steel lock, a sharp, violent bang rattled the metal door from the inside. I jumped back, my heart slamming against my ribs. "Hey!" I called out, reaching for the heavy flashlight at my belt. "Facility is closed! Who's in there?" Silence followed. Then, right at ear level against the thin metal door, came three soft, deliberate knuckles tapping against the steel. Knock, knock, knock. "I'm calling the police if you don't answer," I shouted, taking another step backward. A voice spoke from inside Unit 412. It was muffled, hollow, and dry, like someone whispering through a mouthful of dust. "The latch is caught. Please, just lift the handle from the outside." My hand hovered over the door handle. It sounded so human, so distressed. But then my brain caught up with the reality of the situation. Those two massive steel padlocks were locked firmly from the outside. There was no way anyone could have gotten inside that unit without locking themselves in from the alleyway. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight beam trained on the bottom of Unit 412. As I watched, 5 long, gray, impossibly thin fingers slid out from the microscopic gap between the bottom rubber seal of the door and the concrete slab. The fingers didn't have fingernails, just smooth, pale skin that twitched and scraped against the rough asphalt, reaching blindly for my boots. I turned around and ran. I sprinted back down row D, my breath ragged in my chest, and didn't stop until I slammed the glass front door of the office shut behind me. I locked the deadbolt, slumped into the desk chair, and stared at the monitor bank, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold my flashlight. I pulled the binder over and read Protocol 2 again. If you hear knocking from inside any unit, do not check the lock. Do not speak. Continue walking. Okay, I whispered to myself, wiping cold sweat from my forehead. Okay, it's fine. I'm inside. The doors are locked. I forced myself to look up at the camera screens. Camera 1, front gate, clear. Camera 3, row B, clear. Camera 6, main driveway, clear. Camera 8, row D, directly facing Unit 412. I leaned in toward the screen of Camera 8. The infrared night vision feed was grainy, washed out in shades of gray and white. Unit 412 was visible in the center of the frame. Standing directly in front of the door was a tall, emaciated figure wrapped in what looked like a dark, filthy blanket. Its head was tilted back at an unnatural angle, staring directly up into the camera lens. Even through the low-resolution video, I could see that its eyes were wide, white, and completely devoid of pupils. As I stared at the screen, the figure slowly raised its arm, pointed a single long finger toward the front office building, and took a step forward. Suddenly, the screen for camera 8 went completely static. Then camera 7 went static. Then camera 6. It was walking toward the office, knocking out the cameras row by row. My blood ran cold. I remembered Protocol 4. If camera 8 goes black, turn off the office lights immediately, and do not look out the front window until sunrise. I lunged across the desk and hit the main light switch. The office plunged into total darkness, lit only by the faint blue ambient glow of the remaining monitor screens. I dropped to my knees behind the heavy oak desk, pulled my legs up against my chest, and held my breath. Outside the front office, the gravel crunched. Crunch, drag. Crunch, drag. It was right outside the floor-to-ceiling glass display window at the front of the lobby. Through the thin gap between the desk edge and the floor, I could see the ambient moonlight filtering through the glass. A long, twisted shadow blocked out the light as something massive stood directly on the other side of the glass panel. A long, wet, scraping sound echoed through the quiet room as fingertips dragged slowly down the glass pane. Then came the voice, the same dry, dusty whisper coming from just inches away through the thin glass. I know you're in here. I can smell your sweat. The handle of the front office door began to jiggle. Slowly at first, then faster, violently rattling against the deadbolt. The frame groaned under the pressure, the glass vibrating in its casing. I pressed my hands tightly over my ears, squeezed my eyes shut, and began counting under my breath. 1, 2, 3. The rattling turned into a heavy, rhythmic pounding that shook the entire desk. 4, 5, 6. I kept counting, praying that the deadbolt would hold, praying that the sun would come up, praying that whatever was on the other side of that glass would just go away. I lost track of time. The pounding went on for what felt like hours, sometimes fading into soft, pitiful weeping, sometimes escalating into wild, screeching rages that cracked the glass trim. Then, slowly, the noise began to subside. I didn't open my eyes. I didn't move a muscle. I stayed curled under that desk in the freezing darkness until the first warm light of dawn crept through the front window and the automated streetlights outside clicked off. When I finally stood up at 6:15 a.m., my muscles were so stiff I could barely stand. I looked at the front glass door. The heavy deadbolt had held, but the glass surrounding the frame was spiderwebbed with dozens of deep stress cracks. Smears of a thick, dark, oily residue lined the outside of the pane, smelling faintly of stagnant pond water and copper. I didn't wait for the day shift manager to arrive. I left the keyring and the binder on the desk, got into my car, and drove straight home. I called the corporate office 2 hours later and quit on the spot. A month later, I saw a local news report online. Lakeview Self Storage had quietly closed down, citing structural safety concerns. The property was fenced off, and demolition crews were scheduled to tear down the buildings. I thought about calling the police, about telling them what was locked inside Unit 412, but I knew how crazy I would sound. Besides, I checked the property records last week out of morbid curiosity. Unit 412 wasn't rented to a person. It was leased 30 years ago by the facility's original owner under a corporate trust. The lease agreement had only one stipulation, backed by a prepaid bank account that covered rent for 99 years. The padlocks on Unit 412 must never be removed, and the door must never be opened from the outside. Whenever you're ready, say Story 3, and I will write the next full story to continue building your script. Story 3. The third floor of St. Jude's Hospital doesn't exist on the elevator panel. I spent 6 years working as a float nurse at St. Jude's Memorial Hospital, a sprawling gray brick medical center built in the late 1960s. When you work nights in a hospital, you get used to weird things: disoriented patients wandering the halls, strange noises coming from empty rooms, and the heavy, lingering stillness that settles over the corridors after visiting hours end at 8 p.m. You get numb to it. But there was one thing no nurse ever joked about: the third floor. If you looked at the exterior of St. Jude's from the parking lot, the hospital clearly had 5 stories. Floor 1 was ER and radiology, Floor 2 was ICU, Floor 4 was pediatrics, and Floor 5 was surgery. Floor 3 was a band of dark, narrow windows running around the middle of the building. But if you stepped inside any of the 4 central elevators, the button panel went straight from 2 to 4. When I asked my charge nurse, Brenda, about it during my orientation, she didn't even look up from her paperwork. "Mechanical layer," she said flatly. "HVAC, water pipes, electrical junctions. It's locked off. Don't worry about it." "Why isn't there a stairwell door for it?" I asked. Brenda paused, her pen hovering over a patient chart. She looked at me over the rim of her reading glasses, her expression unreadable. "Because there's nothing on the third floor you need to see, David. Leave it alone." For 3 years, I did just that. I took the stairs, I rode the elevators, and I ignored the fact that whenever the elevator passed between the second and fourth floors, the car would slow down, the lights would flicker, and a cold, damp draft would seep through the elevator door seals. Then came a stormy Tuesday night in mid-November. I was working a 12-hour shift on the fourth floor. Around 2:30 a.m., an elderly patient in room 412 named Mr. Henderson, a frail man suffering from severe advanced dementia, went missing. His bed was empty, his telemetry monitor was buzzing a disconnect alarm, and the hallway door was wide open. We checked the floor, the staff break rooms, and the supply closets. Nothing. I volunteered to check the main central stairwell. I grabbed my clipboard and heavy badge reel, stepped out into the stairwell, and began descending the concrete steps, calling out Mr. Henderson's name. The stairwell was brightly lit with industrial fluorescent tubes. I walked down from the fourth floor landing toward the second floor, expecting to find him leaning against a handrail. As I reached the landing between 4 and 2, I stopped. Where there should have been a solid, unbroken brick wall marked with a painted yellow pipe, there was a door. It was an old, heavy steel fire door painted a dull, faded green. The paint was peeling in long, curling strips, and a rusted brass plaque on the center frame read, Floor 3, Restricted Access. The door was standing ajar by 2 inches. I stood on the concrete landing, the cold air rushing out from the crack and hitting my legs. Through the gap, I could hear a sound that made my chest tighten. It was the soft, rhythmic scuff scuff of hospital non-skid socks dragging across vinyl tile, accompanied by a low, confused mumble. "Mr. Henderson?" I called out, taking a step toward the crack. Is is this the way out?" A fragile, raspy voice called back from the darkness beyond the door. "Nurse? It's so dark in here." It was him. He had somehow pushed through the door and gotten trapped inside. "Stay right there, Mr. Henderson. I'm coming in," I called out. I grabbed the heavy metal handle, pulled the door open, and stepped across the threshold onto floor 3. The moment the door swung shut behind me, the bright fluorescent glare of the stairwell vanished, replaced by an oppressive, heavy darkness, illuminated only by the faint emergency exit lights dotted along the ceiling. The smell hit me instantly. It didn't smell like dust or machinery. It smelled like ancient rubbing alcohol, stale flowers, and copper. I clicked on my pen light. The thin beam of light cut through a thick layer of hovering dust. This wasn't a mechanical room. I was standing in a fully furnished, long abandoned hospital corridor. The walls were covered in faded teal wallpaper that was water stained and blistering. On either side of the hallway were patient rooms with heavy wooden doors. Old fashioned metal IV poles, rusted wheelchairs, and overturned wooden gurneys lined the hall like forgotten wreckage. "Mr. Henderson?" I shouted, my voice sounding flat and muffled in the narrow space. "Over here, son! I can't find my room!" The voice came from further down the hall, past a nurse's station covered in piles of decaying paper charts. Sitting on a low, rolling stool in the center of the dark room was Mr. Henderson. He was clutching his hospital gown around his thin shoulders, staring blankly into the dark corner of the room. "Oh, thank God," I breathed, rushing over to him and checking his pulse. His skin was ice cold, but his heart was beating fine. "Mr. Henderson, how did you get down here? Come on, let's get you back upstairs." I reached under his armpits to help him stand, but he grabbed my forearm with surprisingly tight strength. His fingers dug into my skin. "Don't turn around, son," he whispered, his eyes wide with wild, unadulterated terror. I froze. "What?" "I thought they were nurses," Mr. Henderson whimpered, his voice trembling so hard his teeth clicked. "When I came through the door, I thought they were nurses. But they aren't working on the patients. They're keeping them." The temperature in the corridor dropped instantly. My breath bloomed into thick white clouds in the beam of my penlight. From down the long, dark hallway we had just walked, the hallway leading back to the stairwell door, came a sound. Squeak, rattle, squeak, rattle. It was the sound of rusted metal wheels rolling across tile floor. I slowly turned my penlight beam down the corridor. 50 feet away, standing under the dim green glow of an exit sign, were 3 figures. They wore old-fashioned, stiff white nursing uniforms from the early 20th century. Long skirts, pleated aprons, and starch white caps. But the fabric was filthy, stained with dark, dried patches of brown and black. Their arms hung limp at their sides, their fingers unnaturally long, gray, and tipped with sharp black nails. And where their faces should have been, under the shadow of those crisp white caps, there was nothing but smooth, pale, blank skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Beside them sat a heavy iron gurney, its rusty wheels squeaking as one of the nurses pushed it slowly toward us. A voice didn't come from their mouths. It echoed directly inside my head, a synchronized, pitch perfect chorus of calm, professional medical staff. Patient 412 is due for his procedure. Please step aside, staff. Run, Mr. Henderson screamed. The adrenaline hit me like a jolt of electricity. I grabbed Mr. Henderson under his arms, hoisted his light frame over my shoulder in a firefighter's carry, and bolted in the opposite direction down the corridor. Behind us, the slow squeak of the gurney wheels instantly transformed into a terrifying, rapid, metallic clatter as all three figures began to sprint after us, their long, gray limbs slapping against the floorboards with sickening speed. Patient noncompliance detected, the voices chimed inside my skull, louder this time, reverberating against my eardrums. Sedation required. Please return to your bed. I ran blindly through the dark, swinging my penlight frantically from side to side. The corridor seemed impossible, stretching on far past the physical footprint of the building outside. Up ahead, I saw a pair of heavy double doors with crash bars. The service elevator. I threw my body against the crash bar. The doors groaned, metal grinding against metal, and slowly slid open. I threw Mr. Henderson inside onto the steel floor of the service elevator car, jumped in behind him, and smashed my hand against the panel. There was no floor buttons, just a single red emergency lever. I grabbed the lever and yanked it down with all my weight. Outside the car, the three faceless figures burst around the corner. The lead nurse reached out a long gray arm, her sharp black nails missing my face by a fraction of an inch as she lunged toward the opening. The heavy steel elevator doors slammed shut with a thunderous clang. The car shuddered violently, gears grinding overhead, and began to ascend. I collapsed onto the floor beside Mr. Henderson, my lungs burning, my heart hammering so hard I thought my chest would burst. I pulled the old man close, holding him as he wept quietly into my scrubs. A moment later, the elevator came to a smooth stop with a gentle ding. The doors slid open. We were standing in the bright, warm, fluorescent glare of the second floor ICU hallway. Brenda, the charge nurse, was standing right outside the doors holding a tray of meds. She looked down at me sitting on the floor covered in dust, then looked at Mr. Henderson, and then looked at the service elevator panel. Her face drained of all color. She didn't ask questions. She didn't call security. She simply walked over, helped me lift Mr. Henderson onto a wheelchair, and whispered 4 words into my ear. "You leave tonight, David." I handed in my resignation the next morning. I moved 2 states away, took a job at an outpatient clinic that closes strictly at 5 p.m., and never worked another night shift in my life. Mr. Henderson passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 days after that night. On his death certificate, the doctor listed natural causes due to advanced age. But I know what really happened. Because 3 weeks after I quit, I received an envelope in the mail from an anonymous sender in my old town. Inside was a photocopy of an old newspaper clipping from 1972. Story 4. The trail camera in my backyard kept snapping at 3:17 a.m. I bought a plot of land out in the deep woods of northern Pennsylvania back in the spring. It was 5 acres of dense pine, birch, and black oak, completely secluded from town. My plan was simple: build a small cabin, set up off-grid solar, and spend my weekends hunting and decompressing away from the noise of the city. Because local deer and black bears frequented the property, I installed 3 cellular trail cameras along the perimeter to map game movement. 2 of the cameras were standard models that stored images on SD cards, but the third was an expensive cellular trail camera mounted on an old oak tree near the back edge of my property line, facing a shallow ravine. Every time its infrared motion sensor triggered, it immediately pinged high-resolution photos straight to an app on my phone. For the first 2 months, Everything was completely normal. I got dozens of notifications every week. Families of white-tailed deer feeding at dawn, raccoons knocking over brush piles, and the occasional curious coyote passing through the brush under the moonlight. Then, in early October, the pattern started. The first notification came on a Tuesday morning at exactly 3:17 a.m. I was asleep, so I didn't see the push notification until I woke up with my morning coffee at 6:30 a.m. I unlocked my phone and opened the Trailcam app. The image was captured in sharp infrared monochrome. It showed the clearing in front of the ravine, illuminated by the camera's invisible night vision flash. But there was no deer, no bear, no wind-blown branches, just an empty clearing. I assumed a moth had fluttered too close to the sensor lens, cleared the alert, and went about my workday. The next night, my phone buzzed on my nightstand with a sharp vibration. I rolled over, squinting at the bright screen. The clock on my lock screen read 3:17 a.m. I unlocked the phone and opened the new photo. The angle was identical. The dark ravine, the tall pine trunks, the cold fog rolling over the forest floor. But this time, about 40 yards in the background, half hidden behind the trunk of a dead birch tree, was something vertical. It was thin, pale, and completely out of place against the dark bark. It looked like a bare human arm, hanging limply toward the mossy dirt, disappearing into the heavy shadows behind the trunk. I zoomed in until the image pixelated. The skin was unnaturally smooth, almost reflective under the camera's infrared illuminator. My first thought was that a trespasser or a poacher was wandering through my woods in the middle of the night. But why would someone be out in the freezing mountain woods at 3 in the morning without a jacket or a flashlight? The third night, I set an alarm for 3:15 a.m. I sat up in bed in the dark, my phone resting flat in my palm, watching the digital clock roll over. 3:15, 3:16, 3:17. A split second later, the notification banner popped up. Motion detected on camera 3, ravine. My thumb trembled as I tapped the screen. The figure had stepped out from behind the birch tree. It was standing roughly 20 yards away from the lens now, directly in the center of the game trail. It was roughly 7 feet tall, with impossibly elongated limbs and an emaciated, skeletal torso. It wasn't wearing clothes, but it lacked any distinct features, just taut, gray, hairless skin stretched tightly over a protruding rib cage and spindly shoulder blades. Its head was tilted completely sideways, resting almost flush against its left shoulder, and its face was pointed directly at the hidden camera mounted 6 feet up on the oak trunk. Where its eyes should have been, there were two wide, pitch black pits that swallowed the infrared light. And beneath those hollow sockets was a wide, jagged split across the lower half of its head, a lipless, tooth filled grin that stretched from ear to ear. A cold wave of panic rushed through my veins. The camera was mounted using invisible black LED flashes that gave off zero visible light. Animals never even noticed it. Yet, this thing was looking right through the lens, straight at me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun broke over the mountain ridge at 7 a.m., I grabbed my 12-gauge shotgun, loaded 4 rounds of buckshot into the tube, and hiked out to the back edge of the property. The woods were dead silent. No birds chirping, no wind in the canopy. Just the heavy, damp smell of wet soil and rotting leaves. I reached the oak tree where camera 3 was strapped. I approached the spot where the figure had been standing in the 3:17 a.m. photo. The soft dirt on the game trail was trampled. Imprinted deep into the damp mud were footprints, but they weren't human, and they weren't animal tracks. They were narrow 12-inch indentations ending in four elongated, claw like toes that had dug several inches into the earth, as if carrying immense weight. I turned back toward the tree to retrieve the SD card from the camera. When I reached up to unbuckle the nylon strap, I froze. Scratched deeply into the rough bark of the oak tree, right beside the camera housing, were four crude, jagged tally marks carved directly into the wood. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 nights. I felt like every single hair on the back of my neck was standing on end. I felt watched. The sense of an unseen presence lurking in the thickets on the other side of the ravine was so heavy, it felt like physical pressure against my chest. I racked the shotgun, backed away slowly without turning my back to the woods, and hurried back to my cabin. I made up my mind right then. I packed my duffel bag, loaded my gear into my truck, and decided to leave for my city apartment. I was going to list the property for sale on Monday morning and never come back. By the time I finished packing, a violent autumn thunderstorm had rolled over the mountains. Torrential rain pounded the metal roof of the cabin, and thick fog rolled down from the ridges, reducing visibility to less than 30 feet. I climbed into my truck, turned the ignition, and put it in reverse. The tires spun uselessly in the mud. The storm had turned the unpaved dirt driveway into a thick, slick trench of red clay. I tried rocking the truck forward and backward, but the rear axle sank deeper into the mire until the frame bottomed out on the dirt. I was stuck. The nearest tow truck from town wouldn't come up the unpaved ridge road during a severe flash flood warning. I was trapped at the cabin until the rain stopped and the road dried out the following morning. I went back inside, locked the heavy oak deadbolt, latched every window shutter, and barricaded the front door with a heavy wooden dining bench. I brought my shotgun, a box of shells, and 3 heavy flashlights into the living room and sat in an armchair facing the entrance. The storm raged outside for hours. Thunder shook the floorboards, and rain lashed against the wooden siding. Night fell. By 3 a.m., the storm had tapered off into a steady, eerie drizzle. I sat in the armchair in absolute silence, my shotgun resting across my knees, watching the battery percentage on my phone tick down. 3:14 a.m., 3:15 a.m., 3:16 a.m. My heart was beating so hard in my ears, it felt deafening. 3:17 a.m. Zzz. My phone lit up on the side table. Motion detected on camera 3. Ravine. I swiped open the notification. The frame on camera 3 showed the empty clearing by the oak tree. The figure wasn't there. Before I could exhale, my phone buzzed again. Motion detected on camera 2. Driveway. Camera 2 was mounted 50 yards from my front porch. I opened the image. The figure was standing right beside my stuck pickup truck under the drizzle. Its long, gray arms were resting flat on the hood of the vehicle. Its head was tilted back toward the dark sky, its wide, lipless mouth hanging open to catch the falling rain. Bzzz. Motion detected on camera 1. Front porch. Camera 1 was mounted on the exterior wall of the cabin, pointing directly at the front door. I opened the notification with ice in my veins. The image was so close that the figure's pale, leathery face filled nearly the entire frame. Its dark, hollow eye sockets were pressed within inches of the camera lens. Its jagged, grinning mouth was pulled open wide, revealing rows of thin, needle like teeth coated in that dark, viscous sludge. And in its long, gray hand, it was holding something up toward the lens. It was the severed nylon strap from camera 3. Creak! The wooden porch floorboards right outside my barricaded front door groaned under a massive, slow moving weight. I raised the shotgun to my shoulder, aiming the barrel dead center at the middle of the heavy wooden door. "I have a gun!" I roared, my voice cracking with pure terror. "Get the hell off my porch!" Silence hung in the air for 3 long, agonizing seconds. Then, from the other side of the door, just inches from the wood, came a sound. It was a sharp, metal on wood scratching sound. Skirt, 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 skirt. It was carving a 5th tally mark into my front door. A second later, a voice whispered through the keyhole. It was a wet, raspy, gargling imitation of my own voice, mimicking the exact words I had spoken into my phone earlier that afternoon. "The road is washed out. You can't leave." Something massive slammed against the front door with explosive force, shattering the top wooden panel and sending wood splinters flying across the living room. I didn't hesitate. I pulled the trigger. Boom! The 12-gauge blast blew a jagged hole through the center of the door. The sound inside the enclosed cabin was deafening, filling the room with thick white smoke and the sharp smell of burnt gunpowder. From the porch came a high-pitched, inhuman shriek that sounded like tearing metal. I pumped the action, ejected the spent red shell, and fired again through the shattered wood. Boom! Heavy, wet footsteps scrambled off the porch and tore violently through the underbrush, crashing through the pines toward the ravine. I stood there in the dark, choking on the smoke, aiming my smoking shotgun at the blown-apart door. I stayed in that exact position for 3 solid hours, reloading the tube every time my hands stopped shaking long enough to push a shell past the gate. I didn't blink. I didn't lower the barrel. At 6:45 a.m., the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. I shoved the dining bench aside, kicked open what was left of the front door, and stepped out onto the porch. The porch steps were splattered with pools of that dark, foul-smelling black sludge. Embedded in the wood near the door frame were 4 long, broken gray claws, shattered by the buckshot blast. I abandoned my truck. I abandoned my gear. I took my shotgun, walked 5 miles down the washed-out mountain road in the mud until I reached the state highway and flagged down a passing utility van. I never went back to that ridge. I sold the land at an auction 2 months later for pennies on the dollar. The buyer was a logging company that planned to clear-cut the entire acreage for timber. I thought it was over. I thought leaving the land behind would be the end of it. Until 2 nights ago. I was sitting in my 4th-floor city apartment, getting ready for bed. At 3:17 a.m., my phone on the nightstand gave a sharp, familiar vibration. I looked at the screen in disbelief. It was a notification from the Trail Camera app, an app I had forgotten to delete months ago. I opened it, thinking it had to be a system glitch from the server. The app showed a live image from camera 1. The camera wasn't on the mountain cabin anymore. Someone had unbolted the camera from the wood, carried it across the state, and mounted it on the fire escape brick wall right outside my fourth floor bedroom window. The photo showed my bedroom glass, illuminated by the city streetlights, and standing on the narrow iron fire escape, its pale, grinning face pressed flat against the glass pane, was the figure.